Well, hey everybody, this is Robert and welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. Now, the recent Listeria outbreak linked to boar's head deli meats has received a lot of national attention. Besides a massive recall of more than 7 million pounds of deli meat, this has been the largest Listeria outbreak in the US in more than a decade. So, joining me today to talk about Listeria and the outbreak is Brenda Wilson, PhD. Dr. Wilson is a professor of microbiology and an adjunct professor of pathobiology at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Wilson, welcome to the show, ma'am.
Oh, very welcome to be here. It's great.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and start out with the outbreak itself. It's a large outbreak. As of the most recent data is 57 people affected, all requiring hospitalization. And sadly, there were 9 fatalities from 18 states.
Mhm.
So, Dr. Wilson, what are your initial thoughts on this outbreak, and is there anything extraordinary about it?
Well, actually, unfortunately, it's not really all that extraordinary,
Mhm.
other than maybe the number of individuals that were affected by it. But really, we've been having a problem with a number of foodborne illnesses and lots of recalls. Um, Listeria is one of the prominent ones that we've been having. In fact, earlier this year, we had another outbreak that affected, I think there was 26 instances
Mhm.
in 11 states with 23 hospitalizations in that case and 2 deaths. So it's not terribly uncommon. You know, this year alone, there have been, quite a few other, recalls from various foods, um, mostly processed or packaged foods, such as, the Boar's Head one. And, just in 23 last year alone, there were 5 Listeria recalls, as well as 5, sugar toxin E. coli recalls. And then the year before that, there were 6 Listeria and 3 sugar toxin E. coli's. And then before that was even worse. It was 5 Listeria, 4 Salmonella, 2 Shigella, and then 1 Bacillus cereus. So there's a lot of these kinds of things happening, and it's just part of this large scale industrialization of food industry that we have. And it's a challenge, and we see it quite a bit, So
Yeah, and concerning this particular outbreak, it looks like the contamination has been linked to a boar's head plant in Virginia. So,
mhm.
what would you expect to be the source of contamination? Some kind of issue on the production line or something else?
Well, in all likelihood, that's probably the most likely place that it could happen. But you have to realize that Listeria itself is actually an environmental organism, and so it likes warm, moist places. It lives in soil, um, and uh, and damp areas, so it's very easy to contaminate. And if when it does contaminate, the problem is it's a very hardy organism
Right.
as well. And so it's difficult, to treat it because it can withstand, acidic conditions. It can withstand temperatures that are low, like refrigeration
Right.
temperatures, and it can withstand high salt, which are normal preservation mechanisms that people put into for processed foods. And in this particular case, the deli meats, and now also it was not just with the liverwurst that they had, but apparently they've now expanded the recall to include also some of their poultry products. And so there's a lot of places where it could have happened. This is probably, things like surfaces of the meat slicers, the meat mincers and processors themselves. It could be the counters where the meat were being handled, the person's handling the meat if they were just a little bit not careful, um, and and it doesn't take very much. So the key about Listeria is that even if you only have just a few organisms that are contaminating to start with, because they can survive very easily in low temperatures, like refrigeration units, what will happen is they will grow there, and they will actually become many, many more. So you actually are amplifying the process by, just letting them sit in a what they think of as a very rich, nutritious environment for them to grow. And so so it doesn't help necessarily that you have uh, the refrigeration, like you would think with a lot of other types of foods.
Sure. And just want to point something out, and I'm guessing Dr. Wilson will agree with me. Foodborne investigations are some of the most difficult ones to do.
Yes,
Yeah.
they are, because you see something that is there and you don't know if that's actually the real culprit or not.
Yeah.
And you actually have to do some diagnostics to find out if it really is the right organism that's causing the problem. And the rapidness with which food is transported and processed and put on your table
Mhm.
now, it's just so fast that
Right.
it's very difficult for inspectors to really check on things enough, and there's a lot of places where it can fall through the cracks.
Yeah.
um,
And like you mentioned, that liverwurst, at least initially, appeared to be the main culprit, but Listeria has been found in a lot of different food outbreaks. I remember
mhm,
ice cream. I remember other
mhm.
types of
Right, and
cantaloupe.
the
Yeah.
outbreak that was earlier this year actually was in cheeses, soft
Oh,
cheeses.
yeah.
Um, so, uh, so it just it like so a lot of these foods where it has a rich environment for nutrients, and then it can still grow, and that's part of the challenge here, if you will,
Yeah.
with regard to, I think the best strategy that people can take is to one, be cautious of that, but then also cook your food. you know um,
Yeah. That'll pretty much cover it.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
let's go ahead and switch gears to Listeria itself. What is you talked a little bit about some of the characteristics, but what is it, and what is listeriosis?
Well, so listeriosis is an infection with listeria, um, and the symptoms that are associated with that. And listeria itself is a bacterium. It's a very hardy one. Because it's an environmental one, so it can withstand a lot of extreme temperatures and climate conditions. It likes to live in moist areas, and decaying vegetation and animals in the wild. It's very prevalent there in the soil and things. And and this is part of the reason why we have problems with that happens. And with humans, it's usually transmitted through things like unpasteurized or raw milk, dairy products that are not pasteurized or not adequately pasteurized, because pasteurization sometimes is not thorough enough for listeria, especially if you have a lot of the organism and they're protected inside of the food. Um, and then you have sausages and raw meat and deli meats. Any processed food is susceptible to it, uh, and because it's a nutrient for it, and so it survives just fine. Now, the characteristic about listeria is that it actually can, in humans, when it infects humans, it actually will invade inside the cells and hide out from our immune systems. And because it hides out, it's very challenging to clear unless you have a very good and healthy immune system. And that's why there are some people that more, susceptible to it than others. Um, and and as a consequence, listeriosis is so potentially dangerous for some individuals, because that once it's in the food, and even with the refrigeration, you like I said before, it will still grow and there'll be a lot of them. And the individuals, when they are exposed to this food, the listeria has a tendency to go inside your cells, and it will spread from one cell to another. And unless you have a very alert immune system that is constantly watching for cells that are infected, and being able to clear them, it becomes more challenging. And so this is one of the reasons why the elderly, the very young, very young, children, people who are immune compromised in any way, certainly anyone who's on immunosuppressants, and pregnant women in particular, which can be a really, really, really bad situation, because it will move from one cell to another, and it can penetrate the placenta and get to the fetus. And so the likelihood of there being extreme outcomes that are not good for the fetus is very high in pregnant women. And so they are particularly vulnerable for this.
So how common is listeriosis in the US?
Well, if you look at the CDC stats, which are, of course, whatever has been reported, um, about 1,600 people or so get infected with listeria. Most of the time, it is mild, because it's diarrhea, it's symptoms in healthy individuals. It's usually relatively mild, but in the cases where it gets reported, sometimes, so for example, I think the CDC stats say something like 1,600 people get infected with it annually and have to go to the doctor. And of those, about 1,300 or so are hospitalized. And then of those, about 260 end up actually dying from the infection. So it's prevalent enough that we want to be concerned about it.
Well, not only that, I mean, as far as the hospitalization rate and the fatality rate, it's higher than many foodborne illness.
Yes, it's much higher than many, and it's because it hits very vulnerable individuals, and especially in cases of pregnant women and the elderly. And oftentimes it's very hard to know if it actually is it. You have to actually get blood tests to test whether it's listeria, and sometimes it can happen very rapidly depending upon how much of the listeria you've actually eaten. So if you have a highly contaminated food bolus that goes through you, your stomach is not going to be able to handle all of it. And the organism itself is somewhat acid tolerant, so it will pass through, especially if the food is serving as a sort of a buffer, if you will. Um, and then and then you get into your stomach, and then if you have a lot of it there, they can easily invade, and then you have a lot that you have to deal with.
Yeah.
And if you don't have a good immune system, it's going to be challenging to clear it. And oftentimes, when you do have a problem like this, it does require oftentimes intravenous application or administration of the antibiotics to clear it when it's a severe infection. And it will be a severe infection in the case of pregnancy and the elderly and the the immune compromised folks.
Yeah, and you gave these CDC numbers, and is it fair for me to say those are probably lower, because a healthy immunocompetent person like myself may have some diarrhea, but I would never go get tested and never get reported.
Yeah, and by the time you go to the hospital, it probably's over.
Yeah.
Um, but the other thing about listeria is that sometimes it actually has a long delay period between when you ate the food and when you actually have the symptoms.
Mm.
And so that delay can be detrimental, because by that time things have spread so much, and then all of a sudden you're starting to feel the symptoms, and then by that time it's actually pretty bad, and
Yeah.
you really do have to be hospitalized at that stage.
You did cover a little bit about the symptomology of listeriosis. Can you go into it a little bit in more detail, the mild symptoms and then the invasive type symptoms?
Sure. The mild symptoms usually are, a little bit of stomach aches, and certainly some diarrhea. Diarrhea is almost always associated with it.
Mhm.
But fever. And it's not a super high grade, but it's a good, it's a good, 100, sometimes. You're gonna feel feverish. You're gonna feel tired, a lot of lethargy and malaise, symptoms. You can get belly cramps and muscle aches, and certainly because it is an invasive organism, it can affect the nerves, and you might actually get headache. And if you do get a headache and a stiff neck, you better go into the hospital because that means it's serious.
Mhm.
But you might, get confused, loss of balance, convulsions. Those are all symptoms of where it's a very serious infection. And by that time, you really, really do need to go in and get help.
Well, if I can put uh, brightness on this whole situation, it's not transmitted person to person.
No, it's not. It's not contagious at all. This is a foodborne or illness. So it's if you get sick, your next door neighbor, your partner, or anybody, your kids, whoever did not eat the food is not going to get also sick. So that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And also, it is treatable. So most listeria are susceptible to antibiotics, and so. Or at least most of the normal antibiotics. We haven't seen tremendous resistances except for what is already inherent in the organism. Um, but uh, but certainly it is treatable if you know what you have and you
Mhm.
get checked and make sure, and you can get the antibiotics are it is possible to actually treat. So.
Listeria doesn't produce any toxin or anything, does it?
Well, not per se,
Mhm.
but it does have some components that actually benefit its infection process.
Mhm.
And you might call some of those components toxins, if you will. They have to be able to poke holes in membranes in order to get from one cell to another. And so there are some pore forming and membrane disturbing toxins that they do make. Um, it's not a huge amount of them, but it's sufficient to help them in their infection process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. All right. Now, something that I'm always interested in is the actual microbiology. So, Dr. Wilson, can you talk a little bit about the diagnosis of listeria and what laboratory testing is available?
Well, some of the first things that a doctor might ask if they suspect that there might be a bacterial infection involved in your diarrhea or whatever your symptoms that you have, they're going to ask you what kind of food you've recently had in the past, few days or a week or whatever. They're going to ask you, have you had soft cheeses? Soft cheeses is a very common uh, uh, food that Listeria contaminates. So brie cheese, feta cheese. I think the more recent case earlier this year was queso blanco or queso fresco, which some of these soft Mexican cheeses. Um, Raw milk or cheese made with from unpasteurized milk. So certainly, if organic foods, you have to worry a little bit about some of those in this case. And then certainly any processed meats, so lunch meat, hot dogs, sausages, deli meats, all of those, liverwursts, and anything that has been processed, even some of the hams that you might have the whole ham, but then you have to worry a little bit about any meat that gets sliced. Um, and then certainly any foods that have been recalled, you don't want to eat, right? But the doctor will want to ask that. That would be some of the first things that get asked. And then if it really looks like there's something, serious, they're going to first get some blood tests. And so that is the most effective way to find out whether you have Listeria infection. Sometimes they may also ask for urine or spinal fluid, and that is because if you are showing symptoms of, like I said before, of some, you know, um, nerve effects, they might actually ask for that too because they want to make sure that whether your central nervous system has been affected or not. And what they will look for in the blood tests are signs of inflammation. for infection. So there'll be what they call the CRP, the C-reactive protein that they look for. And of course, elevated levels of white blood cell counts, which again indicate that there's a lot of immune cells coming to the site and getting activated and excited because there's an invader. So they're, especially neutrophils, if they detect neutrophils, those are the first responders of the immune system, and that basically says that you've got a very active immune problem. And so once they confirm that, they might want to do some additional testing to see if Listeria actually will grow from some of the body fluids that you might have, or just to see if it's there. And especially if there's an outbreak, they probably will want to sequence it and find out if it's the same thing that other people have, so that they can trace where it's coming from.
Now you're talking about CSF and blood, but one of the things you mentioned was one of the common things is diarrhea, but stool is not really a sample for detecting Listeria.
Well, you probably are not going to see a whole lot of organisms there anymore.
Yeah.
And you might, and certainly they might check, but the quantity probably is not going to be sufficient for them to actually say that it's the Listeria that's doing it. And the diarrhea oftentimes is very watery, and so it's very dilute, and so it's kind of hard to detect organisms in those conditions.
And you've already mentioned it's a bacterium, and so that's treatable by antibiotics. What's the difference between the regimen of a non-invasive versus an invasive infection?
Well, an invasive infection you want to get immediately because it is rapidly going through your body. So intravenous administration is really recommended in those cases where you have a severe signs and symptoms of infection, because it's throughout your body. You want to actually you want to stop it quickly, and the quickest way to do that actually is through intravenous administration of the antibiotics. And usually they also want to make sure that they completely get the organism. So they will usually double up the regimen with usually something like some sort of penicillin, amoxicillin, something along those lines, plus another antibiotic. Oftentimes they'll have gentamicin. Gentamicin can only be administered intravenously, but there can be others, and especially if somebody's allergic to penicillin, then they'll use Cipro, and Cipro is actually becoming very popular. These are fluoroquinolone type of antibiotics, and have been effective with Listeria. The only thing that they for sure are not going to give you are drugs that are related to cephalosporins. Now, even though cephalosporins are somewhat related to penicillins, they are different enough, and it turns out that Listeria is just inherently resistant to them. So there's it doesn't work. Right. Those don't work. But you tetracycline derivatives. So there are some new broad spectrum ones that they might administer. There's some erythromycin is also possible to administer if they're worried about. So you have to worry that the type of antibiotic you have, and if your system is completely flooded with the bacteria, you don't necessarily always want to lyse the bacteria, inside your body. So they might want to actually apply something that is a bacterial static, which will just stop it from growing so that your immune system can clear it. But it just depends on what the doctors think is the best choice at the time for it. Vancomycin is also something that works. But certainly gentamicin has been used in combination with ampicillin or penicillin, and so those are usually what happens. Yeah. And then they go to something else if it doesn't work.
Right. Yeah. Dr. Wilson, let's talk about prevention. What are some? I mean, you've talked a lot about a lot of different things concerning prevention as far as high risk groups and different food types they should probably abstain from. But can you give any special advice to the public, and then also about high risk individuals one more time?
Sure. Well, like I said, Listeria actually is a microbe, so a bacteria, which is susceptible to killing by heat. Okay, so cooking really does make a difference. And if you actually can, make sure that the meat has been thoroughly cooked, it and when I say thoroughly, you want something that's steaming hot. Okay. For it to be adequately cooked. And you don't want to have raw stuff. You want definitely to have pasteurized things, even though it's not a guarantee that it's going to, because there have been instances where some pasteurized food, does have, contamination. But for the most part, it's a good practice, making sure that you use pasteurized milk and dairy products, that that you cook things adequately, and for pregnant women especially, I would actually abstain from having, things like deli meats and things that get sliced a lot, pre-cooked, ready to eat foods. I would cook them again. you know I mean, you can still do it, but you just have to cook it again just to make sure that you kill the bacteria. At least during your pregnancy, I think that that's important. And using appropriate, hygiene practices and sanitation while you're processing and cooking and the food, and cleaning the surfaces of the foods and stuff like that. And especially like if you're using cutting boards, the wooden ones are susceptible to having things getting into their cracks and stuff, and you do need to make sure that you can clean them and sanitize them. And definitely, absolutely, do not eat anything that has been recalled. Don't even try it, because even if it is nearby in that same area, it can also spread to the other foods that are nearby, and so you do have to worry a little bit about that. And especially in the case of Listeria, refrigeration doesn't stop it. So.
Right.
I would throw away the food or bring them back to the store and get, refund or whatever for it. And then I would also clean your refrigerator and the containers and surfaces from, when you know that there's something there. You should, make sure that you have those cleaned so that you don't yourself contaminate your other food.
Yeah, so cross contamination is an issue.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, well, great. This is very informative and really good stuff. Dr. Wilson, any final thoughts on Listeria, the outbreak, anything remotely?
Well, I don't. In terms of the outbreak, I would say, well, unfortunately, it's probably not the last one. But I do say that if you have any of the symptoms, and you think that you have, eaten something that might be in this some of these categories of recalled foods or something like that, I think that you should immediately try to contact your healthcare provider, and especially if you are pregnant or at risk, that it's always a good idea to be safe rather than sorry.
Right? Yeah, good advice. All right, I want to thank you, Dr. Brenda Wilson, for sharing your time and your expertise with us today.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you, ma'am.
Great. Thank you. Bye.